Welcome back to the channel. In quiet neighborhoods, people often believe that life moves in predictable lines. There is comfort in familiar routines, in the warmth of daily habits, and in the belief that the world outside the front door will remain steady. The story we explore today begins in a place just like that, a peaceful suburban town where very little ever seemed unusual. Yet even the calmest places can hold mysteries that linger for decades. Our story centers on Joan Risch, a 31-year-old housewife living in Lincoln, Massachusetts in 1961. To those who knew her, Joan was thoughtful, responsible, and deeply devoted to her family. She lived with her husband and their 2 young children in a quiet part of town, surrounded by neighbors who waved as they passed and children who played freely along the streets. It was the kind of environment where people rarely locked their doors, and where a day could be described simply by the gentle rhythm of household life. Joan's days followed a routine many families would recognize. She prepared meals, cared for her children, read books from the local library, and kept her home in order. Her life did not draw attention. It blended naturally into the pattern of the community. She was the kind of person you might greet at the grocery store or see at a neighborhood gathering, someone whose presence felt steady and familiar. And then, one ordinary autumn day, everything changed. On the morning of October 24th, 1961, Joan went about her usual tasks. There was nothing unusual in her conversations, her mood, or her behavior. Her husband was away at work, her children were at home or nearby, and the town moved through its day as it always had. Sometime during that afternoon, Joan disappeared. When her husband returned later, he found the children safe, but the house carried signs that something unexpected had taken place. There were small marks of disturbance, nothing dramatic, nothing that pointed clearly to one explanation. Joan's car remained parked outside, as though she had stepped away for just a moment. But she did not return. Neighbors later recalled seeing a woman who resembled Joan walking along the roadside, moving slowly, as if deep in thought or in some kind of distress. Yet no one could say for certain that it was her. And as the hours turned into days, and then into years, the mystery only grew larger. What makes Joan's story so haunting is not just the disappearance itself, but the absence of final answers. She did not leave a message. She did not leave a clear trail. Her life simply shifted from present to unknown, leaving behind questions that still echo today. This is the story of a quiet life interrupted, and a mystery that has never found its conclusion. On the afternoon of October 24th, 1961, the quiet rhythm of the Risch household changed in a way no one could have expected. The day had begun normally. There were no appointments, no unexpected visitors, no signs of worry or urgency in Joan's behavior. She spent the morning caring for her children, handling light chores, and maintaining the gentle order of her home. To anyone observing, this was a day like any other. But sometime shortly after midday, a series of small and strange details began to unfold. Details that would become the heart of the mystery. When Joan's husband returned later that day, the house felt still, yet something seemed out of place. Their young daughter had been home, but Joan was nowhere to be found. The first noticeable sign was in the kitchen, a few faint marks on the floor and on nearby surfaces, as though something unexpected had occurred. The amount was not large, not enough to immediately suggest a clear explanation. Instead, it raised questions. Was someone hurt? Had there been an accident? Or was something else unfolding? The telephone, which usually hung neatly on the wall, was no longer in its proper place. It appeared to have been pulled loose or displaced. This single detail held many possible interpretations. Someone might have tried to make a call in a moment of urgency, or someone might have wanted to prevent a call from being made. Yet again, there was no clear answer, only more uncertainty. Other parts of the house showed gentle disturbances, but not the kind one might expect from a robbery or a struggle. Furniture remained in place. Valuable items were untouched. The children's belongings were undisturbed. Nothing suggested chaos. Instead, it felt as though someone had moved through the space with intention, yet left no explanation behind. Outside, Joan's car sat in the driveway exactly where it had been earlier. There were no signs that she had driven anywhere. Her purse, however, was missing a detail that suggests she left the house voluntarily, at least for a moment. Yet the absence of her coat on a cool October day raised further questions. If she stepped outside intentionally, why would she leave without something to keep warm? The most intriguing clues came not from the house itself, but from the neighbors. Several reported seeing a woman resembling Joan walking slowly along the roadway that afternoon. Some described her movements as unsteady, as if she were either tired, confused. Others simply recalled a woman walking with purpose, though quietly. None of the sightings could be confirmed with certainty, but these observations remained some of the last possible glimpses of Joan before her presence faded from the record entirely. This is where the mystery begins to deepen, not with clear conclusions, but with subtle traces that offer only questions. When investigators arrived at the Risch home, the most striking detail they found was not dramatic chaos or signs of a clear confrontation. Instead, what they observed were small scattered traces, just enough to suggest that something unexpected had taken place, but not enough to reveal what that something was. The blood stains appeared in a few locations inside the kitchen, a faint trail on the floor, slight smudges along a surface, and a small area where it looked as though someone might have attempted to clean or wipe something away. This detail became the central puzzle of the case. The quantity was too small to immediately suggest a severe injury. At the same time, it was too deliberate to be dismissed as a minor household accident. It was just enough to raise questions, yet not enough to answer any of them. Investigators examined the pattern and direction of the traces. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no objects knocked to the floor, no broken items. The house did not present the kind of disorder that accompanies sudden violence. Instead, it felt controlled, almost quiet, as though whatever happened occurred without sudden force or panic. Another curious element stood out. A box of tissues had been used, and some tissues appeared stained. This detail suggested someone may have attempted to tend to an injury or clean a surface before leaving. But again, whether this action was done calmly or urgently could not be determined. One of the most debated aspects of the scene was the absence of smeared footprints. If someone walked through blood and moved through the house, there would typically be visible transfer. But the traces were light, contained, and difficult to interpret. It was as though someone had been careful either intentionally or simply because the situation was not severe enough to create more noticeable marks. Experts later considered several possibilities. One was that Joan may have sustained a minor injury, attempted to care for it, and left the house seeking help. This could align with sightings of a woman on the roadside who appeared unsteady. Another possibility was that the scene had been arranged to create a particular impression, though nothing at the home pointed conclusively to staged activity. In investigations, the absence of clarity is often as powerful as any direct evidence. Here, the traces suggested presence, movement, and interruption, but without the continuity needed to form a complete narrative. It left investigators with a question that has remained central to this case. Were these marks the beginning of an emergency or the end of a decision? The scene inside the Risch home offered a quiet mystery, where meaning lay not in what was obvious, but in what could not be explained. Among the details inside the Risch home, one element drew particular attention: the telephone. Normally fixed securely to the wall, it was found loosened and partly displaced, as though it had been pulled or yanked with unexpected force. This detail stood out because it implied a moment of urgency. Something had interrupted the normal flow of the day. Investigators considered several interpretations. One possibility was that Joan had tried to make a call, perhaps seeking assistance, and the phone had been damaged during that moment. If she had felt unwell, afraid, or uncertain, reaching for the phone would have been a natural response. The slight disruption to the device could suggest that something interfered before the call could be completed. But there was another interpretation as well. The phone could have been pulled intentionally to prevent communication, either by Joan herself, by another person. If Joan were trying to create a scene that suggested distress, damaging the phone would have supported that impression. However, if someone else had been present, interfering with the phone would have served to stop Joan from reaching out. With no direct evidence pointing to either scenario, the meaning of this detail remained suspended between opposing possibilities. The placement of the phone and the surrounding objects provided no additional clues. Nothing else in the room appeared, thrown, or disrupted. Items remained in their usual order. No drawers were opened. No furniture was moved. This absence of broader disturbance suggested that whatever happened around the phone was contained and brief. It was not part of a wider incident involving extensive force or disorder. Neighbors were asked whether they heard anything that day. Voices, raised tones, sudden noises. No one reported anything unusual. The quietness of the house did not match the idea of a dramatic confrontation. Instead, it suggested that if the phone was pulled during a moment of tension, it happened quickly and without extended struggle. The phone, then, became a symbol of the case's uncertainty. It pointed to the moment where the story shifted when routine slipped into mystery. But like every other piece of evidence in this story, it did so without offering direction. In many true crime narratives, a physical clue becomes the anchor that leads to answers. Here, the phone became the opposite. It acted as a threshold, something that marked the transition from the known to the unknown, while withholding the reason for the shift. This is part of what makes the disappearance of Joan Risch so compelling. Each detail is clear enough to raise a meaningful question, yet incomplete enough that no question can be settled. The scene inside the house was not chaotic. It was careful, quiet, and limited. And within that quiet, the unanswered possibilities only grew larger. The phone suggests urgency, but urgency toward what and away from what remains unknown. When investigators examined the home more closely, one of the most striking conclusions was what was not found. There were no damaged door frames, no broken locks, no windows left ajar. Every entrance to the house appeared untouched. If someone had entered from the outside, they had done so without breaking anything and without leaving evidence of how they came or went. The absence of forced entry suggested either that no outsider had been present or that whoever entered the home was someone Joan might have willingly allowed inside. Just as, noticeably, there were no missing valuables. Money remained where it was kept. Jewelry and personal items were still in place. The home had not been searched or ransacked. Drawers were not opened, shelves were not disturbed, and nothing indicated that someone had been looking for something. The scene did not resemble a robbery gone wrong or a sudden confrontation that had escalated. This lack of disturbance led investigators to consider whether the event might have unfolded quietly. If there had been an encounter, it had not taken the shape of a chaotic or aggressive moment. Instead, It may have been calm or at least controlled. Yet even this interpretation was only an assumption, as there was no direct evidence to support a clear sequence. The absence of signs also supported another possibility, that Joan may have left the house voluntarily, even if the small traces inside suggested some kind of physical interruption or difficulty. People sometimes walk away from their lives without warning, though rarely in a way that leaves behind ambiguous markings. But if Joan had chosen to leave intentionally, why would there be traces indicating she had been hurt or distressed? And if she had not chosen to leave, how could someone else have entered without leaving behind any indication of presence? Investigators also considered the layout of the home and the surrounding environment. The Risch residence was located in a quiet area, not isolated, but far from heavy foot traffic. Neighbors had clear views of the property. It was the kind of place where an unfamiliar visitor or a disrupted scene might have drawn attention. Yet no one reported seeing a stranger approach the home. No vehicle was observed. No unusual sounds were heard. The day passed quietly, as if the disappearance happened in a moment so ordinary that it slipped past all observation. The absence of signs, then, became one of the most perplexing traits of the case. If something sudden had occurred, there should have been movement, noise, disorder, or panic. Instead, the house felt almost still, like the page of a story that had been lifted away mid-sentence. This is one of the reasons Joan Risch's disappearance remains unresolved. The scene did not point to danger, nor did it point to choice. It existed in a narrow space between the two, where certainty becomes difficult to reach. Mysteries often derive their power from what cannot be seen. Here, what could not be seen became the center of everything. One of the most telling details from that afternoon was found just outside the house. Joan's car, the family vehicle she used for errands, appointments, and daily routines, was still parked neatly in the driveway. It had not been moved. The engine was cool. The keys were not left inside, but the car showed no sign of disturbance. This small detail spoke quietly, but clearly, Joan did not drive away. Whatever happened, it began with her still at home. Inside, another detail gave shape to the unanswered questions. Her purse was gone. This suggested that Joan had left the house willingly, at least at first. Most people do not walk away from their home without taking their purse, especially a mother caring for young children. This pointed to intention, even if only momentary. It implied that Joan may have stepped out with a purpose, perhaps believing she would return. But if she left under her own decision, there were inconsistencies. It was a cool October day. Yet Joan's coat remained at home. If she were planning to walk anywhere, especially with distance in mind, she would most likely have taken it. This contradiction deepened the uncertainty. Taking the purse suggests a purposeful departure. Leaving the coat suggests haste. Investigators considered the possibility that Joan may have stepped outside briefly, perhaps to speak to someone, to retrieve something, or to check on something, and then something unexpected occurred. If that had happened, however, one might expect belongings or footprints or signs of a pause interrupted. None were found. The purse itself was never recovered, which means it never provided answers. No receipts surfaced, no belongings turned up, no identification matched a new location or name. It simply disappeared with Joan, as though it crossed an invisible boundary beyond which records no longer apply. There is another layer to this detail, one that complicates the interpretation further. A purse can be an anchor, an object someone grabs almost automatically when leaving their home, yet the absence of the coat disrupts that familiarity. It suggests either that the departure was unplanned, or that Joan left under conditions that did not allow her to think fully about comfort or preparation. The car, meanwhile, stood unchanged, silent, still. It became a marker of the moment life stopped moving in its ordinary direction. The driveway remained as it had been that morning, but the house and the person who lived in it were no longer aligned with that simplicity. In many unresolved disappearances, vehicles lead to trails, camera sightings, fuel purchases, path of travel, tire marks. But Joan's car offered nothing. It was a boundary line, the last confirmed certainty of her presence and the first sign of her absence. The purse gone, the coat left behind, the car untouched. 3 everyday details. Yet each one opens a different door, and none of them lead to a clear answer. As investigators moved beyond the house, the focus shifted to the world just outside driveways, sidewalks, and quiet neighborhood roads. It was there that the story gained its last known threads, a handful of eyewitness accounts, each small and uncertain yet impossible to dismiss. During the early afternoon of October 24th, several neighbors reported seeing a woman who looked like Joan walking along local roads. The descriptions varied slightly, as eyewitness memories often do, but the core details were consistent. A woman wearing clothing similar to Joan's outfit that day, moving slowly, and appearing unsteady or distracted. Some thought she seemed to be supporting one arm, as if holding it close to her body. Others simply noted that her walk did not match the purposeful stride of someone running errands or heading somewhere specific. One neighbor recalled seeing a woman moving along the road's edge, not quite stumbling but walking, in a way that suggested discomfort or fatigue. Another described seeing someone standing near the roadside, looking down, as if searching for balance or clarity in the moment. None of these witnesses recognized the woman at the time. They connected the observations only later, when news of Joan's disappearance traveled through the neighborhood. Yet, with these sightings came uncertainty. Memory is delicate, especially when shaped in hindsight. The witnesses did not speak to the woman or follow her path. They noticed her briefly, in passing, as part of the day's ordinary movement. No one could say exactly where she was headed. No one saw where she stopped. The glimpses ended as quietly as they had begun. The possibility that Joan was the woman seen on the roadside added weight to the idea that she may have been injured and searching for help. If she had sustained a sudden medical issue, become faint, or felt overwhelmed, walking outside in hopes of reaching assistance would be a natural response. That explanation carries a sense of urgency, one in which she tried to act but may not have reached her destination. Yet there is another layer to consider. The sightings could also suggest direction, choice, or focus an intentional departure rather than a reaction to harm. The slow, deliberate pace might not indicate confusion at all, but contemplation. However, without spoken words, without a destination, without confirmation, every interpretation remains suspended in uncertainty. Search teams later combed the areas surrounding the reported sightings, roadsides, wooded paths, fields, and neighboring streets. They looked for footprints, belongings, pieces of fabric, anything that might have marked a trail, but nothing emerged. The roads returned to their quietness. The landscape offered no memory of who had passed through. These sightings became fragments, small windows, into a moment when the ordinary world still held Joan within it. They represent the last potential glimpses of her as herself, moving through a familiar place that somehow became the boundary between presence and disappearance. A woman was seen walking, but whether she was moving toward help, away from something, or into silence, no one could ever say. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Joan Risch made several visits to the local library. This detail did not seem unusual at first. She enjoyed reading and often returned home with new books. But when investigators reviewed the titles she had borrowed, a pattern emerged that shifted the tone of the case. Among the novels and routine interests were books that focused on individuals who left their lives behind, stories of disappearances, new identities, and starting over in unfamiliar places. These books included accounts of women who had chosen to step away from their public lives, individuals who had removed themselves from their familiar environments, and narratives about how a person might create a new identity with careful planning. Some of these titles depicted situations that mirrored elements of Joan's own life, a quiet domestic routine, unanswered emotional pressures, and the subtle desire for escape that can exist beneath the surface of daily stability. The question these books raised was not a simple one. They did not conclusively prove that Joan intended to leave. People read widely, and curiosity does not necessarily imply intent. A borrowed book is not a plan. Yet, in the context of her unexplained disappearance, the timing felt significant. It was as though a window had opened not into Joan's actions, but into the interior thoughts she may never have shared. Some investigators and researchers suggested that these books could indicate preparation. A person planning to leave their life might look for examples, guidance, or psychological reinforcement. Yet, if Joan had staged her disappearance, one would expect to find evidence of planning financial movements, secret arrangements, or signs of long-term preparation. None were found. There were no withdrawals, no unusual purchases, no hidden correspondence. Her personal documents remained in place. Her relationships appeared steady. Nothing suggested that she was preparing to live under another name. Others argued that the books could have been research for personal interest. Joan was known to have been an avid reader, and some believed she may have been exploring themes related to personal identity or emotional change. People often turn to books to understand their own internal landscapes, sometimes without intending to act on what they learn. But another possibility exists, one that lies between planning and coincidence. The books may have reflected a quiet curiosity, a questioning of one's life direction, even if that questioning had not yet become a clear intention. If Joan had been experiencing private stress, loneliness, or emotional weight, she may not have expressed it outwardly. Instead, she may have searched for meaning through stories of reinvention and escape. The books, then, might not indicate decision, but contemplation. However, in a case defined by ambiguity, the library records remain one of the few concrete details that hint at an inner life not easily visible from the outside. They suggest that Joan was thinking about change in some form, whether practical, emotional, or imagined. This is where the mystery deepens, not through evidence of action, but through the quiet possibility of longing. The books did not answer the question of what happened. They simply reminded us that the inner world of a person may be far more complex than the life others believe they see. As investigators pieced together the clues, the presence of the library books opened the door to one of the most debated theories in the case, the possibility that Joan staged her own disappearance. This idea did not emerge immediately. At first, the focus was on more straightforward explanations. An accident, a sudden medical emergency, or an encounter gone wrong. But as time passed and no trace of Joan surfaced, the theory that she left intentionally began to gain attention. Those who supported this interpretation pointed to several elements that seemed to form a pattern. Joan had studied books about individuals who had walked away from their lives, created new identities, and re-established themselves in distant places. Her purse was missing from the house, indicating she left with at least some awareness of her own movement. And the absence of forced entry or missing valuables suggested that no outsider came into the home. Everything that was absent seemed to point inward rather than outward. Yet, If Joan planned her disappearance, the way she executed it was unusual. Staged disappearances often leave behind logistical traces, a hidden financial account, a prepared address, or correspondence suggesting planning. In Joan's case, there were none. Her bank accounts remained untouched. She had made no secret trips, no purchases that suggested preparation, no travel arrangements. She did not withdraw cash or send instructions to anyone. There was no sign that she intended to abandon her life permanently. Additionally, choosing to disappear in the middle of the day while responsible for her children seemed inconsistent with a carefully constructed plan. A staged disappearance would most likely occur at a time when the departure could be controlled, leaving fewer chances for interruption or confusion. Instead, Joan's disappearance unfolded in the open space of an ordinary afternoon, where the smallest unexpected event could have altered the outcome. Another element complicates this theory: the reported roadside sightings of a woman resembling Joan walking unsteadily. If Joan had planned to leave, one would expect her departure to be deliberate and concealed, not confused, vulnerable, or exposed. The image of a woman supporting one arm, moving slowly and without direction, stands in contrast to the idea of someone confidently stepping into a new life. Supporters of the staged disappearance theory often leaned on the emotional dimension rather than the logistical one. They suggested that Joan may have been seeking a form of escape, not from a single event, but from the weight of routine, identity, or expectation. A quiet yearning for a different life is not always evident to others. Yet even this interpretation remains speculation. No letters or writings were found expressing distress or desire for change. Her relationships showed no clear fractures. Those who knew her described her as stable and engaged in her family life. In the end, the theory of a planned disappearance became less a conclusion and more a reflection of how little certainty exists in the case. The book suggests curiosity. The missing purse suggests motion. The quiet house suggests intention or interruption, but none of these threads tie together cleanly. The theory remains a possibility, but one that leaves as many questions as it attempts to answer. Not everyone accepted the idea that Joan had planned her own disappearance. Many believed something sudden and unplanned had taken place, something that interrupted the quiet rhythm of the afternoon. From the earliest days of the investigation, 3 alternative explanations began to form: an encounter with another person, a sudden medical event, or an accidental injury that escalated beyond her control. The possibility of an encounter, whether brief or significant, was considered because of the faint signs of disturbance in the home. The moved telephone and the traces of blood suggested that something had shifted the day's normal pace. Yet the absence of forced entry raised the question: if someone else had been present, had Joan opened the door willingly? There were no reports of strangers in the neighborhood, no vehicles seen outside the home at suspicious times, and no one noticed unfamiliar movement around the house. If another person had been involved, they left without leaving any sign of arrival or departure. The second theory centered on a medical emergency. Investigators and researchers later suggested the possibility of a sudden illness or internal medical event, something disorienting or painful enough to cause Joan to seek help immediately. This would align with the roadside sightings: a woman walking carefully, supporting her arm, moving slowly, as though trying to reach assistance before losing strength. If Joan was attempting to find help, it is possible she collapsed in an area that was not searched thoroughly enough, or that the landscape at the time, thick woods, stone walls, tall brush, concealed her presence. Over the years, search efforts expanded and modern detection methods improved, yet no trace was found. This absence does not disprove the theory, but it limits clarity. The third theory involves an accidental injury within the home. Some believed Joan might have been hurt while performing a routine task, perhaps carrying something, climbing, or reaching, resulting in bleeding and disorientation. In a moment of confusion or urgency, she may have tried to walk for help rather than staying in the house. The small amount of blood at the scene fits this possibility, not enough to imply a life-ending injury, but enough to indicate real harm. The slow, unsteady walk, described by neighbors, also aligns with this scenario. Yet the question remains, if she left to seek help, how could she have traveled far enough to never be found? All three theories share something in common. They frame Joan's disappearance as a moment of disruption, not intention. They suggest that she expected to return, that the day began normally, shifted unexpectedly, and then moved into a space where circumstance rather than choice shaped the outcome. But like every theory in this case, each relies on inference rather than proof. The physical evidence does not announce a conclusion. The landscape does not reveal what it remembers. And every possibility remains suspended between what could have happened and what cannot be confirmed. This is the quiet tension at the heart of the mystery. Did Joan leave because she chose to, or because something unforeseen carried her away from the life she knew? In the hours after Joan's disappearance, local police organized a search that expanded quickly. Neighbors, volunteers, and community groups joined the effort. They walked along nearby roads, fields, and wooded trails. They looked under brush, through ditches, and around stone walls that bordered the quiet New England landscape. The search continued into the evening and the following days, but nothing surfaced. Not clothing, not personal items, not footprints leading in or out of the area. The landscape offered only stillness. Over the weeks that followed, the search widened. Law enforcement requested assistance from outside agencies, and aerial surveys were conducted over nearby forests and farmlands. Waterways, wells, and ravines were examined. But again, nothing pointed toward Joan. It was as though the day had simply folded around her and left no trace behind. As years passed, the search did not entirely stop it, simply changed form. Whenever construction projects altered land in the surrounding areas, investigators kept watch. When new trails were cut or land was cleared, searches were repeated quietly, just in case. None revealed anything relevant to the case. The environment gave no answers. In the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, advances in forensic technology offered new possibilities. Cases that had once seemed closed gained new life when DNA and trace analysis became more precise. Families and investigators wondered whether Joan's case might be reconsidered under this new light. But the physical evidence in her disappearance was minimal, and there were no preserved samples strong enough to provide new insight. The case remained exactly where it had always been. Later, with the rise of digital databases and broader identity tracking systems, investigators also explored whether Joan might have been living under a new identity. Records, social security data, and public registries were reviewed periodically, but no match was ever found. There was no indication that Joan continued life under another name. If she had lived, she had left no administrative trail behind, something that is exceptionally rare. Even when amateur investigators and online communities took an interest in the case in more recent years, no reliable new evidence surfaced. Many individuals examined maps, recreated routes, compared case files, and reviewed witness statements. Some offered interpretations. Others proposed potential burial sites or overlooked pathways. Each theory added conversation, but none produced the missing piece that could anchor the narrative. The enduring silence of the search efforts became one of the defining elements of the mystery. Disappearances often leave fragments, objects lost along a path, scattered belongings, a recorded name, or a remembered sighting. Here, none of that existed. The absence was complete. This is what has given the case its lasting weight. It is not simply that Joan disappeared. It is that the world did not reveal where she went. No physical evidence emerged to confirm harm. No administrative trail appeared to suggest reinvention. The space between those two realities remains open. And because of that, the mystery did not fade with time. It stayed exactly where it began, unfinished. As the years passed, the disappearance of Joan Risch settled into a kind of quiet permanence. The initial urgency faded, though the mystery did not. The case was never closed, but it also never moved forward in a definitive way. It existed in a state of unresolved possibility, suspended between competing interpretations that each seemed plausible, but none of them provable. Law enforcement kept the case open for decades, returning to it periodically as new investigative methods became available. Each time, the hope was the same, that some overlooked detail might surface, or that a newly developed technique might clarify what older tools could not. But every return led to the same conclusion. There was simply not enough information, not enough physical evidence, not enough reliable testimony, not enough documented movement to build a complete picture of what occurred on that October afternoon. For the Risch family, the disappearance left an absence that could not be filled. Joan's husband never received clarity, and her children grew up with a story defined not by memory, but by uncertainty. There was no final point of understanding to hold on to, only the outline of a life interrupted. For friends and neighbors, the disappearance created a quiet shift in how they understood the safety of their own surroundings. If someone could vanish in broad daylight, without noise or clear cause, what did that say about the world they believed they knew? The larger public came to know the case through articles, documentaries, and discussions in true crime circles. Each retelling added perspective, but none added closure. Over time, the case became part of a particular category of mysteries, stories that are not defined by dramatic events or decisive moments, but by the subtlety of what is missing. There are no clear villains in the story, no dramatic confrontation, no sudden revelation, only the delicate trace of a life that slipped out of sight without leaving a path to follow. This is part of what gives the case its enduring presence. Mysteries with clear conclusions settle into memory, but mysteries without answers continue to echo. They invite questions, theories, speculation, and reflection, not because they promise resolution, but because they never offer it. The disappearance of Joan Risch remains unsolved, not due to neglect nor lack of effort, but because the traces left behind refuse to form a single, coherent path. The clues point in multiple directions, each one meaningful, yet none complete. As a result, every interpretation remains both possible and incomplete at the same time. And so, the story stands where it began. In a quiet neighborhood, on an ordinary day, a woman stepped out of the life that everyone believed they understood and was never seen again. The unanswered question remains at the center. Did Joan leave because something pulled her away, or because something inside her chose to walk into the unknown? There is no definitive answer, only the silence where one should have been. As we look back at Joan's story, we are left with a mystery shaped more by silence than by evidence. A quiet afternoon, a familiar home, a life that appeared steady and ordinary. Yet something happened in those unrecorded moments that changed everything. The clues she left behind are like fragments of a sentence that never reached its end. A phone displaced, a faint trace on the floor, a purse taken, a sighting on a quiet roadside, and then nothing that could complete the story. What lingers? is not just the question of what happened, but the reminder that even the most familiar lives can hold layers we do not fully see. Joan's disappearance sits in that space between what we can know and what we can only imagine. And perhaps that is why this case has endured. It asks us to consider how delicate the boundary is between the everyday world and the unknown. There are stories that end neatly. This is not one of them. But sometimes, the absence of answers tells us as much about life as the answers themselves. Thank you for spending this time with me today, walking through one of the most puzzling unsolved disappearances in modern history. If you found this story thought-provoking, feel free to stay, to listen, and to continue exploring these quiet mysteries with me. I will see you again soon. Take care.